just consider the mathematical and physical impossibility of what this band actually managed to pull off on a live stage. I mean, think about the sheer mechanics of it for a second.
But it's completely wild. It really is.
Right, because you walk into a massive stadium, and if you close your eyes, you hear this impossibly dense, orchestrally layered wall of sound.
Yeah, it literally sounds like a full symphony of progressive rock.
Exactly. It sounds like there are, I don't know, at least 7 or 8 people up performing. But then you open your eyes, you look at the stage, and it is just 3 guys.
Just 3 musicians.
Yeah, just 3. There are no backing tracks playing on some laptop. There's no, hidden keyboardist tucked behind a curtain somewhere. And they didn't bring any extra session players on tour.
None at all.
It's just 3 guys recreating these incredibly complex, massive studio albums, entirely live. I just keep trying to wrap my head around the sheer biomechanical strain of doing that.
Well, it truly is a masterclass in physical architecture, and human endurance. Because when you actually break down the specific roles each of them had to play just to make that sound happen, it almost defies logic.
So where do we even begin with that?
I think we have to start by looking at Geddy Lee's physical multitasking. Because honestly, calling him a bass player is just wildly insufficient.
Yeah, that doesn't really cover it.
Not at all. He was essentially operating as an entire rhythm section and the atmospheric department all by himself.
It's like if you have ever tried to pat your head and rub your stomach at the same time, multiply that cognitive dissonance by about 1,000, and you might understand what Geddy Lee was doing.
That is exactly right. So first, you have his voice. He is singing in this crazy 3.5 octave tenor range.
Which is incredibly high.
Very high. And from a purely physiological standpoint, holding those notes requires immense breath control and vocal cord stamina.
Right. He is hitting these stratospheric notes night after night. But that is literally just the top half of his body.
Yeah, because down in his hands, at the exact same time he is singing, he is playing these aggressively complex contrapuntal bass lines. And we really have to explain how he plays them, because he wasn't just plucking the strings normally.
Right, he had a very specific style.
He utilized this furious, percussive flamenco finger flick technique. He would rapidly bounce his fingers back and forth across the strings, almost like a drummer doing a snare roll,
Wow.
And that gave him this incredibly sharp percussive attack. But doing that requires just immense hand strength and independent timing.
But wait, we aren't even done with him yet. So he's singing at the top of his lungs, his hands are flying through this flamenco technique on the bass guitar, and then...
And his feet are also playing instruments.
It's just absurd.
It really is. While his hands and voice are totally occupied, his left foot is literally dancing across a set of synthesizer pedals.
Like the ones you see on a church organ.
Exactly like those, these big wooden foot pedals at the base. He is using his left foot to trigger these massive floor-shaking electronic notes to fill out the low end.
Unbelievable.
So he is anchoring the rhythm, driving the melody, and laying down the atmospheric foundation simultaneously with all 4 limbs and his vocal cords engaged at maximum capacity.
It is genuinely hard to fathom. So, if Geddy is tied up doing the job of 3 people, that leaves this massive sonic void in the middle of the music.
A huge void, yeah.
And that is the void that Alex Lifeson has to figure out how to fill on the lead guitar.
Right, because in a standard rock band setup, you usually have a rhythm guitarist holding down the thick chords, right? And then the lead guitar player takes the solo over that.
But Alex didn't have that luxury.
No, he was the only guitar player on stage, so he had to invent completely unique harmonic workarounds. He basically pioneered these open string suspended chord voicings.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. For someone who doesn't play guitar, what does an open string suspended chord actually do? Like, how does it trick our ears?
Well, think of a standard rock guitar chord, like a bar chord. When you play it, your fingers press down on all the strings at once.
Okay, got it.
Which can sound a bit muted or maybe small or contained. Alex realized that kind of chord just wouldn't fill an entire stadium.
So what did he do instead?
He would fret the lower strings to get the root note of the chord, but he would deliberately let the highest strings, the B and E strings, just ring out, completely open and unmuted.
So while his fingers are moving around changing the lower chords, those high strings just keep ringing continuously.
Exactly.
It's almost like the drone note on a bagpipe, right? It just creates a continuous bed of sound.
That is a perfect analogy. By letting those high strings constantly ring across different chord changes, it created this massive, shimmering, chorus-like resonance.
It physically fills the acoustic space in the room.
It really does. It literally tricks your ear into thinking there are 2 guitarists playing at once.
Which brings us to the third piece of this puzzle. Because behind them, you have Neil Peart. And you can't even see the guy from the audience half the time, because he is entirely surrounded by a 360-degree drum kit.
His setup was truly extraordinary. And it wasn't just for show, either. Think of his drum kit like the dashboard of a commercial airplane.
Okay.
He was blending highly complex acoustic polyrhythms, so playing multiple conflicting time signatures at once, with a vast array of triggered digital MIDI sequences.
Meaning he's hitting electronic pads to trigger sounds that they couldn't physically play otherwise.
Exactly. He was requiring the immense physical dexterity to basically fly the plane, striking all these acoustic drums, while also using a pilot's mental bandwidth to manage the digital computer systems simultaneously.
It's incredible.
He tied the chaotic energy of the lead guitar and the bass guitar together with absolute metronomic precision.
You're listening to Deep Cuts and Deep Thinking.
It was beautifully engineered.
Today, we were taking you on a deep dive into the meticulously curated sources detailing the history of Rush. Our mission is to uncover exactly how these three suburban kids from Canada built a 40-year, 40 million album legacy.
A legacy that really changed music.
Absolutely. And they did it despite facing brutal, decades-long critical rejection, surviving and thriving through sheer, uncompromising artistic defiance.
Defiance really is the defining word for their entire career, honestly.
So let's explore that, because to understand why they built this complex live machinery in the first place, we have to look at the crucible moment that forced them to define who they really were.
We have to go back to 1975.
Right. They released their third album called Caressive Steel, and, well, by every metric the music industry actually cares about, it bombed.
It was a catastrophic commercial failure. I mean, it only sold about 40,000 copies in their home country of Canada.
Which is nothing for a major label band.
Not at all. To put that in perspective, they went out on tour to support it, and they were playing to half-empty rooms and just completely disinterested crowds.
Ouch.
Yeah, the band and their road crew actually nicknamed it the Down the Tubes Tour.
That is so depressing.
They were completely broke, barely scraping by, and facing the very real possibility that the recording contract was going to be torn up.
And right on cue, the label, Mercury Records, steps in and essentially corners them. They give the band a strict ultimatum.
As labels do.
Yeah, they say, look, you need to drop this sprawling progressive rock stuff. Stop writing 10-minute songs about fantasy elements. We need short, accessible radio hits. Make a commercial rock record, or we are dropping you from the label.
It is the classic music industry pressure point. The pressure to conform was immense for them, and their response to that pressure is what cemented their legacy forever.
Because they didn't cave.
No, instead of caving to the label's demands, instead of writing a 3-minute pop song, they delivered a massive defiant rejection of commercialism.
They released the album 2112.
Yes, they did. And the centerpiece of 2112 is a 20-minute dystopian science fiction epic that takes up the entire first side of the vinyl record.
I love this so much. It's like a movie director being ordered by the studio to make a light romantic comedy, and instead they deliver a 3-hour black and white sci-fi tragedy.
Oh, right.
And somehow it becomes a massive blockbuster anyway.
It really was that audacious. The narrative of the 2112 suite is entirely about individual expression fighting back against collectivist authoritarian control.
Okay, tell me more about that story.
Well, the villains of the story are these entities called the priests of the temples of Syrinx. In the story, the priests control all art, all reading, and all music, mandating that everything must serve the collective rather than the individual.
I see where this is going.
Yeah, it does not take a literary scholar to see that this was a direct, barely veiled allegory for the record label, trying to control the band's art.
Now, there is a very specific element of 2112 that we definitely need to address, because it sparked a controversy that followed them for decades in the press. The album included a dedication to, quote, the genius of Ayn Rand.
The thematic core of the 2112 suite was explicitly inspired by Ayn Rand's novella, Anthem. Now, before we explore this, I want to be incredibly clear to you, the listener. We are not endorsing these political viewpoints, nor are we taking any sides in the political spectrum.
Absolutely. No political endorsements here, just the facts of how this impacted the band's history.
Exactly. We are remaining strictly neutral and simply reporting on the history contained in the source material we are analyzing today. And the historical fact is that Neil Peart was reading Rand at the time, and he used her themes of extreme individualism as a philosophical shield against corporate record label control.
So it's more about the band's survival than macroeconomics.
Right. He wasn't trying to make a macroeconomic policy statement. He was using the philosophy to defend their artistic integrity against an industry that explicitly wanted to commodify them.
But the music press at the time did not read it that way, did they?
No, they certainly didn't. Critics at major publications, particularly Rolling Stone and the British magazine NME, aggressively misread the album's intentions.
How so?
They interpreted the individualist philosophy as a proto-fascist or extreme right-wing ideology. It created this deeply hostile, toxic relationship between the band and the mainstream critical establishment that would literally last for decades.
And it's worth noting that to clarify his actual stance, Peart later in life explicitly distanced himself from Rand's dogmatic objectivism.
Yes, he did.
He stated that his early interest was purely about artistic liberty, and he eventually identified himself as a, quote, bleeding heart libertarian, emphasizing human empathy and community alongside individual freedom.
Which really highlights the danger of critics applying a rigid ideological lens to a piece of art that was essentially just a young musician's defense mechanism against corporate interference.
Totally.
But the beautiful irony of all of this is that regardless of the critical backlash, 2112 was a massive, unprecedented commercial success. The fans connected with it instantly.
It gave the band absolute creative autonomy going forward.
It did.
They won.
Yeah.
I mean, they bit everything on their most uncompromising, uncommercial artistic vision, and they won absolute freedom, which makes their next move, honestly, kind of baffling.
How so?
Well, because they fought so hard to secure this sacred guitar, bass, and drums power trio dynamic. That is what saved them. But then the 1980s roll around and they start saturating their sound with new wave synthesizers.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Was that not a massive betrayal of the very fans who saved them during the 2112 era?
That tension is the central paradox of their mid-career. They fought tooth and nail to secure their artistic freedom, and once they had it, they completely refused to stagnate or just repeat themselves.
So they evolved?
Exactly. In the 1980s, with albums like Signals and Grace Under Pressure, they actively compressed those sprawling progressive architectures into much more tightly constructed radio-accessible formats. And yes, they heavily embraced synthesizers.
But this wasn't just a stylistic shift, was it? It triggered a literal technological arms race inside the band itself.
It did. And you're absolutely right to point out the audience reaction, because a significant portion of their fan base did feel alienated. They saw the keyboards as a betrayal of the heavy rock authenticity they loved.
I can imagine.
But for the band, the synthesizer revolution was just a brand new palette of colors to paint with. Geddy Lee, in particular, really championed this era. The sources mention his specific love for a machine called the PPG Wave synthesizer.
So why the PPG Wave specifically? Like, what did that give them that other keyboards didn't?
It actually comes down to how the frequencies behave in a mix. Older, purely analog synthesizers from the 1970s were incredibly thick and sludgy in the mid-range frequencies.
Right.
When you played a chord, it ate up all the sonic space in the room. But the PPG Wave was a hybrid. It used digital wavetables.
What does that mean for the sound?
It means it produced a much more crystalline, transparent, icy texture. Geddy loved it because that digital transparency actually allowed Alex's lead guitar to cut through the mix without getting swallowed by a wall of electronic sludge.
But even with that transparency, Alex Lifeson was struggling, right? Because the lead guitar role, which was the driving force of their early sound, was being severely marginalized in the writing process.
It created intense internal friction. Alex felt deeply sidelined. The keyboards were driving the actual songwriting, and his guitar was being relegated to a textural, supplementary role, just adding colors rather than driving the riff.
That's tough for lead guitars.
Very. There's a famous story from the mixing sessions of the song's subdivisions. When the producer wasn't looking, Alex would sneak over to the mixing board and physically push his guitar faders up to make them louder.
No way.
Yeah. And their longtime producer, Terry Brown, would immediately step in and push the guitar faders right back down to keep the synthesizers dominant.
That has to sting. You are 1/3 of this brotherhood, and your producer keeps literally turning you down.
It was incredibly painful. And Terry Brown wasn't just some hired hand. He had co-produced every album with them since 1975. He was essentially the fourth member of the band.
Wow.
But Terry actually hated the new wave direction they were going in. He hated the electronic drums Neil was integrating. He hated the reggae influences they were trying out.
So they were just at a total creative impasse.
Exactly. The impasse became insurmountable. They realized they couldn't move forward together, which ultimately led to the amicable but deeply painful firing of Terry Brown.
They sacrificed their closest collaborator to protect their artistic evolution.
They did.
But they survived the synth wars of the 80s. And as the 1990s rolled around, we see another massive shift. They stripped their sound back down. Albums like Counterparts saw them return to a raw, heavy, guitar-driven sound. Why the sudden shift back? Was it a reaction to the grunge era?
It was partly the changing musical landscape of the 90s, sure, but mostly it was internal fatigue. They had pushed the synthesizer technology as far as it could possibly go, and they missed the raw, visceral energy of just being a rock band.
Makes sense.
So the synthesizers were pulled way back, Alex's lead guitar was front and center again, and Geddy went back to his aggressive Fender bass lines.
And right in the middle of this return to form, Neil Peart completely reinvents his rhythm architecture. In 1994, he is already considered one of the greatest drummers on the planet, but he decides his playing feels too stiff.
This speaks volumes about who Neil Peart was as a person. He was a relentless perfectionist.
He really was.
He sought out a legendary jazz drum instructor named Freddie Gruber. Under Gruber, Neil completely shifted his physical approach to the instrument.
Wait, what does that actually mean for the listener? Like, if I'm listening to a track before and after Freddie Gruber, what am I hearing? What is shifting?
You are hearing the difference between a machine and a dancer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, before Gruber, Neil played with rigid, up and down metronomic strikes. It was incredibly precise, but very stiff. Gruber taught him fluid, circular stroke vectors.
So changing the actual motion of his arm?
Exactly. He even changed how he held the sticks, adopting a traditional grip to utilize the natural bounce and gravity of the drumstick. Essentially, Neil tore his technique down to the studs and rebuilt it so that his incredibly complex math rock beats finally had a human swing or groove to them.
It's amazing that a master would go back to being a student like that. But just as they reached this incredibly mature, grounded phase of their career in the late 90s, everything stops.
Yes.
They are completely derailed by a real-world catastrophe, a tragedy that proves their bond went far, far deeper than just the music.
It's heartbreaking. In August of 1997, literally just after finishing a massive major tour, Neil Peart's 19-year-old daughter, Selena, was tragically killed in a single car accident.
It's just unimaginable. And then, just 10 months later, in June of 1998, his wife, Jackie, passed away from terminal cancer.
Yeah.
Neil later wrote that he believes she essentially died of a broken heart.
It is an incomprehensible level of grief. At his daughter's funeral, Neil looked at Geddy and Alex and simply told them, "Consider me retired."
He just stopped.
Yeah.
And honestly, looking at how the music industry operates, this is where the story usually ends or takes a very cynical turn.
Absolutely.
We often think of arena rock bands as corporate businesses, right? They are massive financial machines with hundreds of crew members, managers, and accountants depending on them for income. Most bands facing a hiatus of unknown length would have just hired a session drummer to keep the tour money flowing. The label would have absolutely demanded it. But Geddy and Alex didn't do that.
No, they didn't. They completely suspended the entity of Rush. For 5 years, the band effectively did not exist.
5 years.
Yeah, Geddy and Alex pursued small, low-key solo projects just to keep themselves creatively engaged, but they made absolutely no move to replace Neil. They simply waited.
Meanwhile, Neil embarks on this solitary, open-ended motorcycle journey across North and Central America.
He did.
He rode over 55,000 miles, essentially trying to outrun his grief and find a reason to keep living, which he documented in his profoundly moving memoir, Ghost Rider, Travels on the Healing Road. And his bandmates just gave him that space. You don't wait 5 years in the music industry unless the human being is more important than the brand.
Exactly. It proves Rush was fundamentally a brotherhood first and a band second. They gave their friend the grace to heal, truly not knowing if he would ever pick up a drumstick again.
And that brotherhood saved the band.
It did. That profound brotherhood is ultimately what allowed them to return. By 2001, Neil had remarried, he had slowly found his footing in life again, and he told the guys he was ready to try playing music in a basement just to see how it felt.
Which is incredible.
That organic reunion led to the album Vapor Trails in 2002.
And it was this triumphant, aggressively guitar-heavy return. No synthesizers at all, just raw, emotional power. It kicked off a late career renaissance that finally forced the entire music establishment to acknowledge what their fans had known all along.
Which brings us to the year 2013, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
It's about time they got there.
Yes. They were inducted after a 15-year delay. They had actually been eligible since 1998, but historical critical bias kept them out.
Right, that lingering bias.
Exactly, that bias against progressive intellectual rock that started back in the 2112 era was a real institutional barrier. But eventually, the sheer weight of their legacy and the relentless fan pressure became too immense for the Hall to ignore.
And their induction ceremony was legendary. The audience, which was packed with their fans, basically took over the room, giving them a massive standing ovation for minutes before they could even speak.
It was a beautiful moment.
And Alex Lifeson's acceptance speech is an absolute all-time classic. He stood at the microphone and just repeated the phrase, blah, 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 with varying emotional inflections for over 2 minutes.
It was a stroke of genius. It was a hilarious, perfectly executed satire of the decades of pretentious, critical discourse and industry award politics that had ignored them for so long. He said everything that needed to be said without saying a single actual word.
It perfectly encapsulates their humor. They eventually embarked on their final tour, the R40 tour, which culminated on August 1st, 2015, and the stage design for that tour was a total masterpiece of visual storytelling.
It was brilliant. They played a reverse chronological set list.
Wait, what does that mean?
So they started the show playing their newest material with a massive, elaborate, modern stage production. But as the night went on, the road crew actively dismantled the stage behind them while they played.
That is so cool.
By the end of the concert, they were playing their earliest, oldest songs on a completely stripped-down stage. They were standing next to basic amplifiers, sitting on wooden chairs, looking exactly how they started playing together in high school gymnasiums.
It's such a beautiful way to close the loop on their career. But behind the scenes, that tour had to be the end because Neil's body was physically giving out.
Yes. Remember that biomechanical strain we talked about at the very beginning of this deep dive?
Yeah.
The sheer physical toll of playing those impossible drum parts for 40 years had caught up to him. He was suffering from severe chronic tendinitis and other ailments. He quietly decided to retire because he wanted to preserve his artistic standard.
That makes total sense.
He wanted to spend time with his family rather than watch his performance degrade on stage.
And then, tragically, after a very private 3.5-year battle with glioblastoma, an aggressive form of brain cancer, Neil Peart passed away in January 2020.
The global outpouring of grief when that news broke was immense, which really raises an important question to leave our listeners with today.
What's that?
Think about this. For 40 years, the cultural gatekeepers, the major magazines, the critics, the music industry executives dismissed this band as uncool, pretentious, and irrelevant. Yet, millions of engineers, scientists, outcasts, and misfits found profound, life-changing emotional connection in their complex math rock.
It's a huge disconnect between the tastemakers and the actual people listening.
It is. What does it say about our culture that the so-called experts were so utterly wrong about a band that meant so much to so many people?
That is something to think about.
And perhaps it proves that true legacy isn't written by the critics at all. It's sustained entirely by the audience. We started this conversation marveling at the mathematical impossibility of 3 men sounding like an entire orchestra. But when you look at everything they survived, the label ultimatums, the critical hostility, navigating changing decades of musical trends, and enduring unimaginable personal tragedy, the real impossibility wasn't their massive sound, it was their endurance.
If you like this episode, please support the show by liking and subscribing.